They called her the plainest girl in London. They laughed when she entered the ballroom. They whispered cruel jokes behind gloved hands. But what they didn't know, what none of them could possibly imagine, was that the woman they mocked would one day return to shake the very foundations of their glittering world. This is the story of Clara Whitmore, the girl society threw away like yesterday's newspaper, who transformed rejection into revolution and humiliation into power. Stay until the end to discover how the woman no one wanted became the woman everyone needed. Hit that like button and comment which city you're watching from. The crystal chandeliers of Ashworth House blazed like fallen stars, casting prismatic light across the most exclusive ballroom in London. It was the opening night of the 1867 social season, and every person who mattered, or believed they mattered, had squeezed into the marble halls wearing their finest silks and their sharpest judgments. Clara Whitmore stood near a potted fern in the corner, her gloved hands folded so tightly that her knuckles had gone white beneath the fabric. She had learned long ago that the best way to survive these events was to become part of the furniture, quiet, still, unnoticed. The emerald dress her stepmother had chosen for her was beautiful in theory, with its careful beading and fashionable bustle, but Clara knew the truth. It had been selected to make her disappear. The color turned her complexion sallow. The cut emphasized her angular frame rather than flattering it. That was the point. "There she is," came a voice that sliced through the music like a blade. "Poor little Clara, hiding among the plants where she belongs." Clara didn't turn. She knew that voice. Beatrice Ashworth, daughter of tonight's host, whose beauty was matched only by her cruelty. "I heard she had to be threatened with disinheritance just to attend tonight," another voice joined in, this one belonging to Margaret Sinclair. "Imagine being such a burden to your own family." The laughter that followed was delicate, refined, perfectly calibrated to wound without seeming overtly cruel. These women had been trained since birth in the art of elegant violence. Clara forced herself to breathe slowly, deeply. 5 years of these events had taught her that reactions only fed the beast. If she showed pain, they would circle like sharks. If she showed anger, she would be labeled hysterical. Her only defense was stillness. "Clara, dear." The voice that interrupted the mockery was honeyed poison. Clara's stepmother, Victoria Whitmore, glided toward her like a swan, all grace and concealed menace. "You mustn't hide yourself away. You're making our host think you're ungrateful." Victoria was everything Clara was not, or rather, everything Clara had been told she was not. Tall where Clara was average, voluptuous where Clara was slender, golden-haired where Clara's hair was the color of wet sand. More than that, Victoria possessed the kind of beauty that made men stupid and women desperate. "I wasn't hiding, Mother," Clara said quietly. She never called Victoria stepmother in public. That had been made clear years ago. "Of course not." Victoria's smile was radiant, her voice loud enough to carry. "My darling girl is simply observing, aren't you? Learning from those of us who were blessed with natural ease in social situations." The nearby women tittered. Clara felt the familiar burn of humiliation in her chest, but she kept her face neutral. "Come," Victoria continued, linking her arm through Clara's with theatrical affection. "Let me introduce you to some people. You can't spend the entire evening talking to plants." As Victoria steered her through the crowd, Clara caught fragments of conversation. "Such a saint, taking her in after her mother died. Can't help what you're born with, I suppose. Heard she hasn't had a single caller in 3 seasons." Each whisper was a small knife, but Clara had developed a thick skin. What choice did she have? Victoria guided her to a cluster of older women, all wives of wealthy merchants trying to buy their way into aristocratic circles. They received Clara with the kind of forced politeness reserved for unwanted relatives. "Mrs. Pemberton, you remember my stepdaughter, Clara," Victoria said, her hand resting possessively on Clara's arm. "Of course," Mrs. Pemberton replied, her eyes sliding over Clara like she was assessing livestock. "She's grown." "Indeed," Victoria beamed, "though I keep telling her she'd benefit from more time outdoors. Fresh air does wonders for the complexion." Clara's complexion was fine. There was nothing wrong with her skin, but Victoria had a gift for identifying perfectly normal features and transforming them into flaws through sheer repetition. "And perhaps some plumper meals," added Mrs. Pemberton, warming to the theme. "My daughter swears by a regime of butter and cream, Puts roses in the cheeks. Clara has such a delicate appetite, Victoria sighed. I worry about her constitution. They were discussing her as if she were a sickly plant they were trying to nurse back to health, not a woman standing right in front of them. Clara had endured countless conversations like this, well-meaning advice that was really just another way of cataloging her supposed deficiencies. The music swelled, and couples began moving toward the dance floor. Clara felt a familiar dread settle in her stomach. This was always the worst part, watching everyone pair off while she stood against the wall with the other wallflowers and chaperones. "Oh dear," Victoria said suddenly, her eyes fixed on something across the room. "I must speak with Lady Hardwicke before she leaves. Clara, do stay here and be sociable." She swept away in a rustle of silk, leaving Clara stranded among the merchant wives who had already lost interest in her. Across the ballroom, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. Duke Julian Ravenscroft had arrived. Clara had never been formally introduced to the Duke, but everyone in London knew who he was. At 32, he was one of the most powerful men in England, wealthy beyond measure, politically influential, and possessed of the kind of aristocratic features that made sculptors weep. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his evening clothes impeccably tailored, and he moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of a man who had never doubted his place in the world. He was also, Clara had heard, impossibly arrogant. Refused 3 proposals last season. Says he won't marry until he finds a woman worthy of the Ravenscroft name. Standards are impossibly high. The whispers followed him like smoke. Julian appeared not to notice, stopping to speak with this lord or that lady, accepting their deference as his natural due. Clara watched with detached curiosity. She had no romantic illusions about men like the Duke. They existed in a different sphere entirely, one where people like her were barely visible. Clara Whitmore. She turned to find Thomas Ashworth, son of tonight's host, standing beside her. Thomas was pleasant-looking in an unremarkable way, and he had always been kind to her, or at least less cruel than the others. "Thomas," she acknowledged with a small smile. "Would you do me the honor of the next dance?" he asked. Clara's surprise must have shown on her face because Thomas grinned. "I promise I won't step on your feet." "Well, I'll try not to." Yes, thank you." It was the first time anyone had asked her to dance in 2 years. As Thomas led her to the floor, Clara caught sight of Victoria's face in the crowd. Her stepmother looked furious, but she quickly masked it with a brittle smile. Clara understood immediately. Victoria wanted her to be invisible, but not so invisible that it reflected poorly on the family. This dance was acceptable, barely, because Thomas was respectable if not particularly prestigious. The music began, a waltz, and Thomas proved true to his word, managing the steps without crushing her toes. "You're a good dancer," he said as they turned. "Better than me, certainly." "My mother taught me," Clara replied, "before she died." "I remember her a little," Thomas said. "She was kind, always had sweets in her pockets for the children at church." The memory made Clara's throat tight. Her mother had been kind, gentle, completely unsuited to the harsh realities of life. When fever had taken her 7 years ago, Clara had lost the only person who ever looked at her with unconditional love. Within 6 months, her father had married Victoria. Within a year, Clara had learned what it meant to be truly alone. "Thank you for asking me to dance," Clara said quietly. "You shouldn't have to thank anyone for basic courtesy," Thomas replied, and there was an edge of anger in his voice. "The way people treat you, it's not right. It's how things are. It doesn't have to be." The dance ended, and Thomas returned her to the side of the ballroom with a small bow. "You deserve better than this, Clara. I hope you know that." Before she could respond, he was gone, swept up by his mother for introductions to some visiting French aristocrat. Clara stood alone again, but something had shifted. Thomas's kindness had cracked something open inside her, a place she usually kept locked and sealed. For just a moment, she let herself feel the full weight of her loneliness, her isolation, the crushing unfairness of a world that judged her so harshly for reasons she couldn't control. "Miss Whitmore." The voice was male, unfamiliar, and tinged with amusement. Clara turned to find Lord Peter Ashworth, Thomas's older brother and a notorious gossip, standing nearby with 2 of his friends. All 3 men held champagne glasses, and wore expressions of barely suppressed laughter. "Yes?" Clara asked warily. "We've been having a debate," Peter said, swirling his champagne. "My friends here believe the Duke of Ravenscroft will ask someone to dance within the hour. I believe he'll leave without dancing at all. What's your opinion?" It was a trap. Clara could smell it. "I wouldn't presume to predict the Duke's behavior," she said carefully. "Oh, come now," Peter pressed. "Surely you have an opinion, or perhaps you're hoping he'll ask you." His friend snickered. "I have no such hopes," Clara said, her voice flat. "Wise," Peter nodded sagely. "A man like that has certain standards. No offense, of course." "Of course," Clara echoed, feeling the familiar numbness spreading through her chest. "Although," Peter continued, warming to his theme, "it would be the charitable thing to do. The Duke is always going on about noblesse oblige and duty to lesser. I mean, to those less fortunate." "Peter!" The voice cut through the conversation like a whip. Lord Peter's face went pale. Duke Julian Ravenscroft stood 3 feet away, and he was not smiling. "Your Grace," Peter stammered, "we were just—" "I heard exactly what you were doing," Julian said coldly. "It was as boorish as I've come to expect from you." He turned to Clara, and for the first time in her life, she found herself the subject of the Duke's direct attention. His eyes were dark gray, almost silver in the chandelier light, and they studied her with an intensity that made her want to disappear into the floor. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and the room around them had gone very quiet. "I apologize for Lord Ashworth's appalling manners." Clara didn't know what to say. She was aware of dozens of eyes watching this exchange, of whispers starting to spread through the crowd like wildfire. "It's quite all right, Your Grace," she managed. "It is not all right," Julian corrected, "but I suppose we must expect such things from those who lack breeding." The insult hit Peter like a slap. His family might host grand balls, but they were new money, barely 2 generations removed from trade. For the Duke to question their breeding was devastating. Peter's face flushed red, but he didn't dare respond. Instead, he and his friends melted back into the crowd. Clara stood frozen, unsure whether she should thank the Duke or simply escape. The decision was made for her when Julian's companion, a tall, elegant man with sharp features, leaned in and whispered something in his ear. Julian's expression changed. Something flickered across his face. Was it pity? Clara felt her stomach drop. "Miss Whitmore," Julian said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet ballroom. "I wonder if I might have the honor of the next dance." The room exploded into whispers. Clara stared at him, completely unprepared. This couldn't be happening. The Duke of Ravenscroft did not dance with girls like her. This had to be some kind of joke, another elaborate way to humiliate her. She started. "Unless you're otherwise engaged," Julian prompted. And there was something in his tone now, something that made Clara's skin prickle with warning. She should say no. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to escape before whatever was about to happen played out. But dozens of eyes were watching, and Victoria was making her way through the crowd with a look of barely contained fury on her face, and Clara suddenly realized that refusing the Duke would be seen as the height of rudeness. "I would be honored, Your Grace," she heard herself say. Julian offered his arm. Clara took it, feeling like she was walking to her execution. As they moved toward the dance floor, she caught fragments of excited whispers. "Never dances with anyone. What is he thinking? She must be mortified." The music began, another waltz, and Julian's hand settled on her waist with practiced ease. Up close, he was even more intimidating. Everything about him screamed perfection, from his posture to his expensive cologne to the way he moved with absolute confidence. They began to dance. Julian was an exceptional dancer, leading with such skill that even someone nervous could follow easily. But there was no warmth in it, no genuine connection. Clara felt like she was being moved around the floor by a particularly sophisticated automaton. "You dance well," Julian said after a moment, his voice perfectly polite and completely empty. "Thank you, Your Grace." "Where did you learn?" "My mother taught me." "I see." Silence fell between them, filled only by the swell of the orchestra. Clara could feel the weight of every eye in the ballroom. This was the most attention she had received in her entire life, And all of it was because the great Duke Julian Ravenscroft had deigned to notice her existence for precisely 3 minutes. "You must be wondering why I asked you to dance," Julian said suddenly. Clara's heart stuttered. It's not my place to question. It's quite simple, really," he continued, speaking over her. His voice remained low, conversational, but something about his tone made Clara's blood run cold. Lord Peter's behavior was inexcusable. I thought a gesture of kindness might shame him into better manners. A gesture of kindness. Not actual kindness. A gesture. A performance. "That's very thoughtful of you, Your Grace," Clara managed, her voice mechanical. "I try to do my duty," Julian replied. "Those of us with position have a responsibility to set an example, even when it requires sacrifice." Sacrifice. The word hung in the air between them like poison. Clara felt something crack inside her chest. She had spent 5 years learning to endure mockery, learning to smile through cruelty, learning to convince herself that the opinions of these people didn't matter. But this casual, careless confirmation that dancing with her was a burden, a charitable act, a sacrifice, this was somehow worse than all the whispered insults combined. Because it was true. Looking at her through Julian's eyes, she could see herself clearly, plain, unremarkable, someone whose only value was as an object lesson in noblesse oblige. She wasn't a person to him. She was an opportunity to demonstrate his superior character. The music swelled toward its conclusion. "I appreciate your kindness, Your Grace," Clara said, and was surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Though I hope you won't feel obligated to make such sacrifices on my behalf in the future." Something flickered in Julian's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or annoyance that she'd spoken with anything approaching spirit. The dance ended. Julian stepped back and bowed formally. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Whitmore." "The honor was mine, Your Grace." She curtsied, turned, and walked away with her head high and her hands trembling. Behind her, she heard Julian's companion speak loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "That was very generous of you, Julian, though I must say, one must be selective about the company one keeps. Dancing with every plain girl in London would leave little time for more elevated associations." Julian's laugh was quiet, but it carried. "Indeed. One must maintain certain standards." The words hit Clara like a physical blow, but she didn't stop walking. She made it to the edge of the ballroom, past the potted ferns, through a side door, and into a mercifully empty corridor before her legs gave out. She sank onto a velvet bench, her whole body shaking. Maintain certain standards. Every plain girl in London. Sacrifice. The words repeated in her mind like a drumbeat, and with them came a flood of memories. Every cruel remark, every pitying glance, every time she'd been overlooked or dismissed or treated like furniture. 5 years of carefully constructed defenses crumbled in the face of the Duke's casual cruelty, because it wasn't even meant to be cruel. That was the worst part. He had genuinely believed he was being kind. He had danced with her out of pity, used her to make a point about civility, and never once considered that she might have feelings worth protecting. To him, she was less than nothing. "There you are." Victoria appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of controlled fury. "What?" she said, her voice shaking with rage. "Did you think you were doing?" Clara looked up, too exhausted to pretend. "I accepted a dance invitation." "You made a spectacle of yourself," Victoria hissed, glancing back to make sure they were alone. "The Duke of Ravenscroft asks you to dance out of pity, and you actually accept? Do you have any idea how that makes this family look? I thought refusing would be rude. Refusing would have shown proper understanding of your place." Victoria moved closer, looming over Clara like a bird of prey. "Instead, you paraded yourself around that ballroom, letting everyone see exactly how unsuitable you are. Do you know what they're saying? They're laughing at you, at us, at me for having to claim you as family." "I'm sorry," Clara whispered, because it was expected. "Sorry isn't enough." Victoria's eyes glittered with something Clara had seen before. Calculation. "This cannot continue, Clara. Your presence is becoming an embarrassment that I can no longer tolerate." Fear spiked through Clara's chest. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Victoria said softly, "that something must be done about your situation. Your father may be too soft-hearted to see it, but you're a burden on this family. Tonight proved that beyond question. Please. We'll discuss this at home. Right now, you will remain in this corridor until the ball ends. I won't have you causing any more damage." Victoria swept away, leaving Clara alone in the dimly lit hallway. She sat there for nearly 2 hours, listening to the muffled sounds of music and laughter from the ballroom. Through the walls, she could hear the party continuing without her, could hear people dancing and drinking and enjoying themselves while she huddled on a bench like a scolded child. This was her life. This would always be her life. Unless something changed. Clara closed her eyes and tried to imagine what change might look like. Running away? She had no money, no skills, nowhere to go. Rebellion? Against what? The fundamental unfairness of being judged for her appearance? She might as well rebel against gravity. The music finally stopped around midnight. Clara heard the sounds of departing carriages, the chatter of satisfied guests heading home to dissect the evening's entertainment. She wondered how many of them would tell the story of the Duke dancing with plain Clara Whitmore. How many times would that story be retold, each version adding new layers of mockery? She waited until the sounds faded completely before standing on shaky legs and making her way to the front entrance where her family's carriage waited. The ride home was silent. Victoria stared out the window with tight lips. Clara's father, a soft-spoken man who had long ago surrendered all authority to his second wife, kept his eyes on his hands. Clara sat in the corner feeling like a ghost. When they arrived at their townhouse in Mayfair, Victoria finally spoke. "Henry," she said to Clara's father, "we need to discuss Clara's future. Tonight made it abundantly clear that she cannot continue in London society." Henry Whitmore shifted uncomfortably. "Victoria, perhaps we're being too hasty." Hasty. Victoria's voice could have cut glass. "Your daughter has been a burden on this household for 5 years. She brings no value to our social standing, frightens away any potential suitors with her dour demeanor, and tonight she made us the laughingstock of the Ashworth ball. How much longer must we endure this?" "She's my daughter," Henry said weakly. "And she needs to be somewhere she can't cause further damage." Victoria turned to Clara with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I've been thinking, Clara dear, that perhaps you might benefit from some time away from the city. Fresh air, quiet surroundings, time to reflect." Clara's mouth went dry. "What do you mean?" "Your father owns an estate in Cornwall, on the coast. It's been empty for years, but I'm sure it could be made habitable." "You want to send me to Cornwall?" Clara's voice cracked. "I think it would be best for everyone," Victoria said smoothly. "You're clearly unhappy in London, and London is clearly unhappy with you. In Cornwall, you could find peace, purpose, even." "You mean you want to exile me?" "Such dramatic language," Victoria tutted. "I'm thinking of your well-being." Clara looked at her father, silently begging him to intervene, to protect her, to do anything. But Henry Whitmore just looked tired and old and utterly beaten. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "it would be good for you, Clara. A change of scenery." Something inside Clara shattered. Her own father was willing to send her away rather than stand up to his wife. After 5 years of humiliation, after tonight's devastating public dismissal, after everything she had endured, she was being discarded like damaged goods. "When?" Clara asked, her voice hollow. "Within the week," Victoria said briskly. "I'll arrange everything. You'll have servants, of course, and a generous allowance. Everything you need to be comfortable. Everything except family. Everything except home. Everything except hope." Clara stood, her legs somehow holding her upright despite the way her entire world was crumbling. "May I be excused?" "Of course, dear." She walked to her room with mechanical precision, closed the door, and stood in the darkness. The face that looked back at her from the mirror was pale, drawn, exhausted. Plain, they called her. Unremarkable. A girl so beneath notice that dancing with her was a sacrifice. Clara touched the glass, tracing the features she had been taught to hate. Were they really so terrible? Or had she simply been told they were terrible so many times that even she believed it? Tomorrow Victoria would begin making arrangements. Within days, Clara would be shipped off to a forgotten corner of England, out of sight and out of mind. London society would forget she ever existed. The Duke would never think of her again. and Clara Whitmore, plain, powerless, pitied Clara, would disappear into exile with nothing to show for her life but a catalog of humiliations and a heart full of wounds. She stared at her reflection until the darkness outside turned to gray dawn, and in that long, terrible night, something shifted deep inside her chest. They wanted her to disappear. Fine. She would disappear, but not in the way they expected. The carriage rattled over increasingly rough roads, carrying Clara further from London with each passing mile. 3 days had passed since the ball, and Victoria had wasted no time arranging the exile. The speed of it all felt like violence. Clothes packed by servants she barely knew, a tearless goodbye from her father who couldn't meet her eyes, and Victoria's brittle smile as she watched Clara's trunk being loaded. "Right when you're settled," Victoria had said, though they both knew she never would. Now Clara pressed her forehead against the cold window glass, watching the landscape transform from manicured estates to wild, windswept moorland. The driver, a taciturn man named Roberts, had barely spoken 20 words since they left London. Even he seemed to understand that this wasn't a journey worth celebrating. As afternoon faded to dusk, the air changed. Clara could smell salt on the wind, could hear the distant roar of something vast and angry. The carriage crested a final hill, and there it was, the sea. But not the gentle, picturesque sea of paintings and poems. This was something primordial and terrifying. Great gray-green swells throwing themselves against jagged cliffs in explosions of white foam. The sky hung low and heavy, the color of old bruises, and seabirds wheeled and screamed in the wind. "Ravenwood Cottage," Roberts announced, the most words he'd spoken in hours. The name was absurdly generous. The structure clinging to the clifftop looked less like a cottage and more like something the sea had tried to claim but hadn't quite managed to destroy. It was built of dark stone that seemed to drink in the fading light, with a slate roof missing several tiles and windows that stared out at the ocean like empty eyes. This was to be her home. The carriage stopped in a courtyard choked with dead weeds. Roberts climbed down and began unloading Clara's trunk without ceremony. She stepped out onto ground that felt unstable beneath her feet, not literally, but the whole world seemed to tilt and shift in the howling wind. The door to the cottage opened and a woman emerged. She was perhaps 50, with iron gray hair pulled back severely and a face that suggested she'd spent her life being disappointed by people. "Miss Whitmore?" the woman said, her voice flat. "I'm Mrs. Brennan, housekeeper." "It's good to meet you," Clara managed. Mrs. Brennan's expression suggested she disagreed, but was too professional to say so. "Your stepmother sent instructions. I've prepared the main bedroom and stocked the larder. There's a girl from the village comes twice a week to help with cleaning. Mary, simple thing, but willing enough. That's all the staff there is." In London, the Whitmore household employed 12 servants. Here, Clara would have a housekeeper and a simple girl who came twice weekly. The message couldn't be clearer. Roberts deposited Clara's trunk inside the doorway and touched his cap. "I'll be heading back before dark, miss. Road's not safe after nightfall." "Of course, thank you for—" But he was already climbing back onto the carriage, eager to escape this desolate place. Within moments, the sound of hooves faded, leaving only the wind and the sea. "Best come inside," Mrs. Brennan said. "Standing in the cold won't improve matters." The interior of Ravenwood Cottage was just as cheerless as its exterior suggested. The furniture was old and sparse, the walls bare stone, the whole place carrying the smell of damp and disuse. Mrs. Brennan had clearly tried. There was a fire burning in the main room, and candles lit against the gathering darkness. But no amount of effort could make this place welcoming. "Kitchen's through there," Mrs. Brennan said, pointing. "Bedroom upstairs. Study to the left, though there's not much in it save some old books. Privy's out back. Well, water's clean enough if you boil it first." Clara nodded, feeling like she was receiving instructions for survival in the wilderness rather than a tour of her new home. "I live in the village, 3 miles down the coast road," Mrs. Brennan continued. "I'll come mornings to prepare meals and see to things. If you need me otherwise, you'll have to send Mary or come yourself." "The village. How large is it?" "Port Talon? 100 souls, maybe. Fishing folk mostly. Keep to themselves." Mrs. Brennan's tone made it clear that Clara should do likewise. I see. I've left cold supper on the table. Bread, cheese, some ham. There's tea if you want it. Mrs. Brennan moved toward the door, already pulling on her heavy cloak. I'll be back at 7 tomorrow morning. Wait, you're leaving now? It's past 5 o'clock. I've my own home to see to. But Clara looked around the dim, cold cottage. I don't know where anything is. You'll sort it, Mrs. Brennan said without sympathy. You're a grown woman, not a child. Candles are in the drawer by the stove. More wood for the fire is in the shed outside. Lock the door after me. Wine sometimes blows it open. And then she was gone, footsteps crunching across the courtyard and fading into the howling darkness. Clara stood alone in the main room of Ravenwood Cottage, listening to the wind throw itself against the walls and the sea crash against the cliffs below. For the first time since leaving London, she felt the full weight of her situation settle on her shoulders. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't a brief retreat to the countryside. This was exile, pure and simple, and it was going to last for the rest of her life unless she found some way to change it. She forced herself to move. First, lock the door, as Mrs. Brennan had instructed. Then light more candles. There was no gaslighting here, no modern conveniences at all. Finally, investigate the cold supper waiting on the rough wooden table. The bread was dense and dark, nothing like the refined white bread she was used to. The cheese was sharp and crumbly. The ham was heavily salted, probably to preserve it in this damp climate. But Clara was hungry enough that none of that mattered. She ate mechanically, washing it down with lukewarm tea that tasted of iron from the well water. When she finished, darkness had fallen completely outside the windows. The cottage creaked and groaned around her like a living thing. Clara climbed the narrow stairs to the bedroom, carrying a candle that threw wild shadows on the walls. The bedroom was small, with a single narrow bed, a washstand, and a trunk for clothes. One window looked out toward the sea, though Clara couldn't see anything now but her own reflection in the dark glass, a pale ghost of a girl who looked even more lost than she felt. She changed into her nightgown with trembling hands, climbed into the bed that smelled of lavender and mothballs, and pulled the thin blankets up to her chin. Sleep should have been impossible, but exhaustion won. Clara fell into dark, troubled dreams of drowning and falling, and voices laughing in empty ballrooms. She woke to pale gray light and the screaming of gulls. For a moment she didn't know where she was. Then memory crashed back, and with it came a wave of despair so strong it pinned her to the mattress. This was real. This was her life now. Clara forced herself up, dressed in one of her simpler gowns, and went downstairs to find Mrs. Brennan already in the kitchen, preparing porridge on the ancient stove. "You're awake," the housekeeper observed. "Thought you might sleep till noon, being city folk." "I'm an early riser," Clara said quietly. "Well, that's something." Mrs. Brennan ladled porridge into a bowl. "Eat this. You'll need your strength if you plan to last here." The porridge was thick and bland, but hot. Clara ate it standing at the kitchen counter, aware of Mrs. Brennan's eyes on her. "Your stepmother sent specific instructions," Mrs. Brennan said after a moment. "You're to have £1 per month for household expenses. That's to cover food, heating, any repairs. I'm paid separately, so don't think of dipping into it." £1 per month. In London, Victoria spent that much on a single hat. "I understand," Clara said. "Do you?" Mrs. Brennan's tone was sharp. "I don't think you do, miss. £1 doesn't go far, especially here where everything comes dear. You'll have to be careful, resourceful. No more London ways." "I'll manage." "We'll see." Mrs. Brennan turned back to her work. "There's a market in Port Talon on Saturdays. I can show you the way this week, but after that you're on your own. Villagers don't take kindly to strangers, so keep your head down and don't put on airs." The morning passed in a blur of practical instruction. Mrs. Brennan showed Clara how to work the temperamental stove, where to find supplies, how to light the lamps that would be her only illumination come evening. It was all so far removed from Clara's London life that she might as well have been transported to a foreign country. When Mrs. Brennan finally left at noon, Clara found herself alone again. She stood in the main room, listening to the silence that wasn't really silence. The wind never stopped. The sea never stopped. The cottage never stopped creaking and settling. She should rest. She should unpack her trunk. She should do something productive. Instead, Clara pulled on her cloak and went outside. The wind hit her like a fist, so strong she had to brace herself to stay upright. Her hair tore free from its pins and whipped around her face. The sky hung low and threatening, full of the promise of rain. Clara walked toward the cliff edge, drawn by the roar of the sea. When she reached it, she stopped, staring down at the rocks below where waves exploded into spray. It was a long way down. A fatal way down. For a terrible moment, Clara understood why they'd sent her here. Not just to hide her away, but to break her. To make her so miserable that she simply faded. One day they'd get word that poor Clara had taken ill, or had an accident, and they would mourn appropriately before getting on with their lives, relieved to be free of the burden. You'll want to step back from there. Clara spun around, heart hammering. A man stood 20 feet away, or rather, a boy on the edge of manhood, perhaps 17 or 18. He wore rough working clothes and had the weathered face of someone who spent his life outdoors. His dark hair was wild from the wind, and he watched Clara with cautious, intelligent eyes. "The edge is unstable," he continued, taking a careful step closer. "Especially after rain. Whole sections fall into the sea sometimes." Clara realized she was standing perhaps 2 feet from the precipice. She took several quick steps backward, heart still racing. "Thank you," she managed. The young man studied her for a moment. "You're the London girl. Moved into Ravenwood Cottage." It wasn't a question, but Clara nodded anyway. "Clara Whitmore." "Finn McAllister." He gestured toward the village. "My father has the fishing boat, the Peregrine." An awkward silence fell. Finn didn't seem inclined to leave, but neither did he seem to know what to say. Finally, Clara spoke. "Do you come up here often?" "Sometimes. When I need to think." His eyes moved to the cottage, then back to Clara. "Place has been empty for years. We thought it might fall down eventually." "I'm sorry to disappoint you." A ghost of a smile crossed Finn's face. "Didn't say I was disappointed. Just surprised." He paused. "You planning to stay long?" "I don't have much choice." Something in her tone made Finn look at her more closely. Understanding dawned in his eyes. He'd heard the story, or part of it. Exiled daughter, unwanted burden. However the gossip had spread, he knew she wasn't here by choice. "Well," he said after a moment, "if you need anything, advice about the area, where to find things, you can ask in the village. Most folk keep to themselves, but they're not cruel." "Thank you." Finn nodded, touched his cap in a gesture that was more habit than deference, and walked away across the wild grass toward the coastal path. Clara watched him go, then turned back to the sea. The encounter had shaken something loose in her chest. Finn hadn't looked at her with pity or contempt. He'd simply looked at her like a person, offered practical help, and moved on with his day. It was such a small thing, but it was the first genuine kindness anyone had shown her in longer than she could remember. The days began to blend together. Mrs. Brennan arrived each morning, prepared meals with grim efficiency, and departed by noon. Mary, the simple girl from the village, came twice weekly to scrub floors and beat rugs, working in terrified silence as though Clara might bite. Otherwise, Clara was alone. She tried to establish routines. Morning walks along the cliff path, though she learned to give the edge a wide berth. Afternoons in the small study, where she discovered that the old books Mrs. Brennan had mentioned were actually a surprisingly extensive library. Poetry, philosophy, scientific treatises, novels that had been banned in polite London society. Reading became her salvation. In those books, Clara found worlds where she could disappear for hours at a time, where her loneliness and exile meant nothing. On her 6th day at Ravenwood Cottage, Mrs. Brennan announced it was market day in Port Talon. "You'll need to come with me," the housekeeper said. "Learn the way and who to buy from. Can't have me doing your shopping forever." The walk to Port Talon took nearly an hour along a rough coastal path. Mrs. Brennan set a punishing pace, and Clara struggled to keep up, her London shoes completely unsuited to the terrain. The village itself was a handful of stone buildings clustered around a small harbor where fishing boats bobbed in water the color of slate. The market was barely worthy of the name, a few stalls selling fish, vegetables, bread, and household goods. Everything smelled of salt and seaweed. People stared as Clara followed Mrs. Brennan through the small square. Not obviously, not rudely, but she could feel their eyes tracking her movements. The London girl, the exile, the stranger. "That's Davies," Mrs. Brennan said, pointing to a man selling fish. "Fair prices, fresh catch. Over there's Mrs. Z. Penrose. Vegetables, eggs, cheese. The bakery is Tremaine's son, though the bread's nothing special." Clara tried to memorize it all while simultaneously avoiding the stares of curious villagers. "And you'll want to avoid the Widow Crane," Mrs. Brennan continued, lowering her voice. "Sells herbs and such, but there's talk she's not quite right in the head. Best to stay clear." They made their purchases: fish for the week, vegetables, some flour and sugar, and Mrs. Brennan haggled over every penny. Clara watched and learned, understanding that this was a necessary skill now. £1 per month meant every purchase mattered. As they prepared to leave, a woman approached them. She was perhaps 30, with kind eyes and work-roughened hands. "Mrs. Brennan," she said quietly. "Might I have a word?" "Mrs. McAllister," Mrs. Brennan acknowledged with a nod. "What is it?" Mrs. McAllister glanced at Clara, hesitated, then spoke. "It's about my Finn. He mentioned meeting the young lady up on the cliffs. Said she seemed, well, he worried she might do herself harm, being up there alone so often." Clara felt her face burn. I would never—" "I'm sure," Mrs. McAllister said quickly. "But Finn has a good heart, and he wondered if perhaps the young lady might benefit from some company, some purpose." "What are you suggesting?" Mrs. Brennan's tone was sharp. "There are children in the village who could use learning," Mrs. McAllister said carefully. "Reading and such. Most of us can't do more than sign our names. If the young lady had time, and if she was willing—" Clara stared at her. "You want me to teach?" "Only if you're able," Mrs. McAllister said. "There's no money for it, I'm afraid, but it would be a help to the families." Mrs. Brennan snorted. "Miss Whitmore isn't here to run a school for fisherfolk." "Actually," Clara heard herself say, "I think it's a wonderful idea." Both women turned to look at her in surprise. Clara's mind was racing. Teaching, purpose, something to fill the endless, empty hours. Something to make her feel like a human being instead of a ghost haunting an empty cottage. "I'd be happy to help," Clara continued, warming to the idea. "I'm not a trained teacher, but I can read and write. I know some mathematics, some history. If the children want to learn, I want to teach." Mrs. McAllister's face broke into a genuine smile. "That's very kind of you, miss. Perhaps we could start with just a few children. See how it goes?" "Whatever works best for the families." They made plans. Mrs. McAllister would speak to some of the other mothers, see who was interested. Perhaps they could use the old meeting hall near the harbor. 3 days a week to start, just a few hours each session. On the walk back to Ravenwood Cottage, Mrs. Brennan was uncharacteristically quiet. Finally, she spoke. "You'll regret this. Teaching fisher children is thankless work. They're rough and wild, half of them won't come regularly, and the parents will take your help without a word of gratitude." "Perhaps," Clara said, "but at least I'll be doing something." The first lesson was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Clara spent the intervening days in a state of nervous anticipation, wondering what she'd gotten herself into. When Tuesday arrived, she walked to Port Talon in the gray morning light, carrying a bag containing some old primers she'd found in the cottage library and paper she'd purchased from her meager allowance. The meeting hall was a simple stone building near the harbor, cold and damp and smelling of fish. Mrs. McAllister was already there with 5 children ranging from perhaps 7 to 12 years old. They watched Clara with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. "This is Miss Whitmore," Mrs. McAllister said. "She's kindly agreed to teach you your letters. You'll treat her with respect, won't you?" The children mumbled something that might have been agreement. Mrs. McAllister gave Clara an encouraging smile and left, closing the door behind her. Clara stood facing 5 pairs of eyes, suddenly terrified. She had no training for this, no idea how to teach children who probably had no interest in learning. "Well," she said, her voice sounding thin and uncertain. "Shall we begin?" The first hour was a disaster. The children were restless, unused to sitting still. 2 of them couldn't speak clearly enough for Clara to understand. One, a girl of about 9 named Bethan, announced that learning was stupid and she'd rather be home helping her mother. Clara felt her confidence crumbling. This had been a terrible idea. She didn't know what she was doing, and these children could sense it. Then the oldest boy, perhaps 12, spoke up. "What's it like?" he asked. "London?" The other children leaned forward, suddenly interested. Clara hesitated. She could describe the London she was supposed to have lived in, the parties, the elegance, the glittering society. Or she could tell the truth. "Lonely," she said finally. "Beautiful in some ways, but very lonely." "Were you rich?" Bethan asked, her earlier hostility forgotten. "My family had money, yes." "Then why are you here?" The boy, she thought his name was Caden, looked genuinely confused. "If I was rich, I'd never leave London." Clara sat down on the edge of the table, abandoning the formal teacher position she'd been trying to maintain. "Sometimes people send you away," she said quietly, "not because you've done something wrong, but because they don't want you around. That's what happened to me." The children absorbed this in silence. Then Bethan spoke again, her voice softer. "My da says rich folk think they're better than us." "Some do," Clara admitted, "but being rich doesn't make you happy, and being poor doesn't make you stupid, which is why I think all of you should learn to read and write if you want to, because the people who control the words control the power." Something shifted in the room. The children were really listening now. Clara started again, this time abandoning the formal lesson plan she'd prepared. Instead, she told them stories about London, about books she'd read, about places she'd never been but had learned about through reading. And then, almost without realizing it, she began showing them letters, not as dry exercises, but as keys that could unlock all those stories for themselves. By the end of the session, 3 of the 5 children could recognize their own initials. When Clara walked back to Ravenwood Cottage that afternoon, she felt something she hadn't felt since arriving in Cornwall: hope. The teaching became the cornerstone of Clara's new life. Word spread, and more children began attending. Within a month, she had 12 regular students. Within 2 months, she'd started a second session for the younger ones who needed more basic instruction. The work was hard. The children came from harsh backgrounds, and many of them struggled with concepts that seemed simple to Clara. But they were also eager and bright in ways that surprised her. Finn McAllister had been right. The villagers might keep to themselves, but they weren't cruel. Slowly, painfully slowly, Clara began to feel like she belonged. But acceptance in Port Talon didn't mean she'd escaped her past. Letters from London arrived monthly, though never from Victoria. Her father wrote brief, awkward notes full of weather observations and empty inquiries about her health. There was never any mention of her returning home. Then one afternoon in her 4th month at Ravenwood Cottage, Clara returned from teaching to find Mrs. Brennan waiting with an expression that meant trouble. "There's a man here to see you," the housekeeper said. "From London. Wouldn't give his name, just said it was important." Clara's heart sank. Had Victoria sent someone to check on her? Had something happened to her father? She found him in the main room, standing by the window and looking out at the sea. When he turned, Clara's breath caught in her throat. Duke Julian Ravenscroft stood in her cottage, looking absurdly out of place in his expensive traveling clothes. "Miss Whitmore, so," he said, inclining his head. "I apologize for the unexpected intrusion." Clara couldn't find words. The man who had humiliated her, whose casual cruelty had set her exile in motion, was standing in her home looking perfectly comfortable and completely oblivious to the devastation he'd caused. "What are you doing here?" she finally managed. "I heard about your work with the village children," Julian said. "It's remarkable. I wanted to see it for myself." Of all the things Clara had expected him to say, that wasn't among them. "You heard about... How could you possibly..." "I make it my business to know what happens in this part of Cornwall," Julian said. "My family has extensive holdings here. When I heard that the daughter of a London gentleman had started a school for fishing children, well, I was curious." He didn't recognize her. Clara realized it with a shock that was somehow worse than his presence. She'd been so forgettable that the Duke of Ravenscroft, the man who had danced with her out of pity just 4 months ago, didn't even remember her face. "You should leave," Clara said, her voice shaking. "I don't know why you're really here, but I'm not interested in visits from London aristocrats who think my work is some kind of amusing curiosity." Julian's eyebrows rose. "I assure you I meant no offense." I'm sure you never do, Clara interrupted, and something in her tone finally made him pause. He looked at her more closely, and she saw the exact moment recognition dawned. His face went pale. Miss Whitmore, he said again, but this time it wasn't a greeting. It was an apology he didn't know how to voice. Get out, Clara said quietly. Please, let me explain. Explain what? That you danced with me as a sacrifice? That elevating your reputation required maintaining certain standards? I was there. I heard every word. Julian flinched as though she'd struck him. I was cruel. Inexcusably cruel. I've thought about that night many times. Well, I've lived with it every single day since, Clara said. So forgive me if I'm not interested in whatever explanation you've constructed to make yourself feel better about your behavior. She walked to the door and opened it, letting in the cold wind and the sound of the sea. Leave. Now. For a moment she thought he might refuse, but then Julian moved toward the door, stopping only when he was close enough to speak quietly. For what it's worth, he said, I truly am sorry. And your school, what you're doing here, it's more valuable than anything happening in London. I meant that sincerely. Your sincerity means nothing to me. He left without another word. Clara stood in the doorway, watching him walk to his expensive carriage, watching him climb inside, watching him disappear down the coastal road. Only when he was completely gone did she close the door and sink to the floor, shaking with anger and shock and a dozen emotions she couldn't name. Mrs. Brennan appeared from the kitchen. Are you all right, miss? No, Clara said honestly, but I will be. That night, alone in her cottage with the wind howling outside and the sea crashing below, Clara made a decision. Julian's visit had reminded her of everything she'd left behind. The humiliation, the powerlessness, the crushing weight of other people's judgment. But it had also reminded her of something else. She had survived. More than that, she had built something meaningful out of her exile. The children in Port Talon were learning, growing, expanding their worlds through the power of words and numbers. If a duke thought that was remarkable, then perhaps it actually was. Clara pulled out a piece of paper and began writing a letter to her father. Not a polite, empty note about weather and health. A real letter, explaining her work, her purpose, her determination to continue regardless of what London thought. She wrote until her candle burned low and her hand cramped. And when she finally set down her pen, Clara felt something settle inside her chest, a quiet, steady conviction that she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The Duke's opinion didn't matter. Victoria's cruelty didn't matter. London's judgment didn't matter. For the first time in her life, Clara Whitmore belonged to herself, and nothing, not exile, not poverty, not the opinions of powerful men, could take that away from her. The morning her letter to her father was due to post, Clara woke to find the sky had turned the color of a fresh bruise. The wind had shifted during the night, coming now from the northeast with a violence that made the cottage shutters rattle like bones. Mrs. Brennan arrived later than usual, soaked through and grim-faced. Storm's coming, she announced, shaking water from her cloak. Bad one. You'd best stock up on candles and firewood. Could be days before it passes. Clara looked out the window at the churning sea. The waves had grown monstrous overnight, throwing spray high enough to reach the cliff top. Should I cancel today's lesson? If you've got sense, yes. Children shouldn't be out in this. But when Clara reached Port Talon that afternoon, determined not to disappoint the students who'd come to rely on her, she found nearly all of them waiting in the meeting hall. Their parents had sent them anyway, Clara realized. A storm was just weather to people who made their living from the sea. The lesson was chaotic. The wind screamed around the building, and the children were restless with the electric energy that comes before a tempest. Claire tried to work through basic arithmetic, but finally gave up and let them tell stories instead. Tales of shipwrecks and smugglers, and the creatures that supposedly lived in the deep water beyond the harbor. My gran says there's a woman lives in the caves north of here, Bethan said, her eyes wide. Says she's a witch who can call storms. That's the Widow Crane, another child, a boy named Joanne, chimed in. Ma says she's mad, says she talks to the dead. Clara remembered Mrs. Brennan's warning about the Widow Crane on that first market day. Sells herbs and such. Not quite right in the head. My ma says Miss Whitmore should meet her. a quiet girl named Morwenna spoke up. Says they'd understand each other, both being outcasts. The words landed like stones in still water. Clara felt the other children go very still, aware that Morwenna had said something forbidden. I'm not an outcast, Clara said carefully. But you were sent away, Morwenna insisted with the brutal honesty of children. Just like the widow Crane was sent away from her village up north. Ma says unwanted women always find each other. Before Clara could respond, the door burst open and Finn McAllister stumbled in, drenched and breathing hard. You need to get the children home, he said without preamble. Storm's coming in fast. My father says it'll hit within the hour. Clara looked at the 12 faces watching her with sudden fear. Some of these children lived a mile or more from the village, up treacherous coastal paths. Right, she said, forcing calm into her voice. Everyone gather your things, quickly now. The next hour was chaos. Clara and Finn worked to get each child safely home, running through wind that tried to tear them from their feet and rain that came in horizontal sheets. By the time they'd delivered the last child, young Joanne, who lived furthest up the coast, Clara was soaked to the bone and shaking with cold. You can't walk back to Ravenwood in this, Finn shouted over the wind. Come to our house, it's closer. The McAllister home was a small stone cottage near the harbor, warm and crowded and full of the smell of fish stew. Finn's mother took one look at Clara and immediately wrapped her in a blanket, pushing her toward the fire. Foolish girl, Mrs. McAllister scolded, but her hands were gentle. Could catch your death. The children are all safe, thanks to you and my son. She pressed a cup of hot tea into Clara's hands. Now drink this and get warm. Clara sat by the fire, listening to the storm rage outside. Through the window, she could see boats straining against their moorings in the harbor, could hear the crash of waves against the sea wall. This was beyond anything she'd experienced, a display of nature's power that made human concerns feel laughably small. How long will it last? She asked. Day, maybe 2, Mrs. McAllister replied. We've seen worse. The cottage is solid. It'll hold. But as night fell and the storm intensified, Clara wasn't so sure. The wind howled like a living thing, and the house shook with each gust. She thought of Ravenwood Cottage, perched alone on its cliff top, with no one to tend its fires or secure its shutters. I should go back, she said, standing. My home will survive or it won't, Mrs. McAllister said firmly. But if you go out in this, you certainly won't. You'll stay here tonight. Clara wanted to argue, but the simple logic was undeniable. So she spent the night on a pallet by the McAllister fire, listening to the storm try to tear Cornwall apart. When dawn finally came, the wind had died to a steady gale. Clara thanked the McAllisters and set out for Ravenwood Cottage, dreading what she might find. The coastal path was littered with debris, branches, seaweed, pieces of boats torn from their moorings. The sea still churned gray and angry beneath a leaden sky. As Clara rounded the final bend, she saw her cottage and her heart sank. 3 windows were broken, their shutters torn completely away. Part of the roof had collapsed, exposing the upper floor to the elements. The courtyard was flooded with seawater that had somehow been driven up from the cliffs below. Clara stood in the wreckage of her home, fighting back tears. She had so little to begin with, and now even that had been taken from her. Miss Whitmore! She turned to find Mrs. Brennan hurrying up the path, her face tight with worry. I tried to come yesterday, the housekeeper panted. Couldn't make it through the storm. I see it's as bad as I feared. The cottage is destroyed, Clara said numbly. Not destroyed. Damaged. Mrs. Brennan moved past her, assessing with a practiced eye. Roof can be repaired. Windows replaced. But it'll cost money you don't have. Clara's meager allowance wouldn't cover repairs like this. She'd have to write to Victoria, beg for additional funds, subject herself to her stepmother's gloating satisfaction that Clara had failed even at exile. There might be another way, Mrs. Brennan said slowly. But you won't like it. What? Write to the Duke. He owns half the county. He has money to spare, and he seemed interested in your work when he visited. The suggestion made Clara's stomach turn. I'd rather live in ruins than accept his charity. Pride's a luxury, Mrs. Brennan said sharply. You think those children will care about your pride when they've got no place to learn? You think the village will respect you more for being stubborn? The word struck home. This wasn't just about Clara anymore. The school mattered. The children mattered. But before Clara could respond, they both heard it. A scream, high and terrified, coming from the direction of the cliffs. They ran. Clara's wet skirts tangled around her legs, but she pushed through, following the sound. As they crested the rise, she saw a scene of horror. The storm had torn away a section of cliff, leaving a jagged gap where solid ground had been. And perched on a crumbling outcrop, barely clinging to the unstable earth, was Morwenna, the quiet girl who'd called Clara an outcast just yesterday. "Don't move!" Clara shouted. "I can't hold on!" Morwenna's voice was thin with terror. "The ground's breaking!" Even as she spoke, more earth crumbled away beneath her. The girl slipped, her fingers scrabbling for purchase. "I'll get help," Mrs. Brennan said, already turning. "There's no time," Clara replied. She could see it clearly. The earth was too unstable, Morwenna's grip too weak. By the time help arrived, the girl would be gone. Clara dropped to her stomach and began crawling toward the edge, distributing her weight as evenly as possible. "Miss, no!" Mrs. Brennan's voice was sharp with fear. "You'll both fall." "Then get a rope." Clara didn't look back. Her entire focus was on Morwenna, who clung to the crumbling cliff face with fingers already white from strain. The ground beneath Clara felt wrong, too soft, too unstable. Every movement sent small cascades of dirt over the edge. She could hear the sea below, waiting. "Morwenna," she called, keeping her voice steady. "Look at me." The girl's terrified eyes found hers. "I'm going to reach for you. When I say, you're going to grab my hand. Just one hand. Keep the other where it is until I've got you. Understand?" Morwenna nodded, tears streaming down her face. Clara inched forward until her arm extended over the void. The edge was so close now she could feel pieces of it breaking away beneath her weight. "Now," she said. Morwenna's hand shot out, small and cold and desperately strong. Their fingers locked together just as more earth gave way, and suddenly Clara was sliding forward, pulled by the girl's weight and the collapsing cliff. Then something grabbed her ankles. Mrs. Brennan, holding on with grim determination even as the ground beneath them both started to go. "Pull!" Clara shouted. They pulled. Clara's shoulders screamed with the effort, her grip on Morwenna's hand turning painful. The girl's weight was dragging them all toward the edge, and Clara could feel the earth shifting, preparing to give way completely. "I'm going to die," Morwenna sobbed. "I'm sorry, miss. I'm sorry." "You're not going to die," Clara grit out. "I won't let you." With a final desperate heave, they hauled Morwenna up over the crumbling edge. All three of them scrambled backward just as the entire section of cliff collapsed, thundering down into the sea below. They lay on solid ground, gasping and shaking. Morwenna was crying, and Clara realized she was crying too, great gulping sobs of relief and terror. "You saved her," Mrs. Brennan said, her voice strange. "You could have died, and you saved her." By the time they returned to the village, moving carefully along a path that suddenly seemed treacherous and uncertain, news had already spread. Morwenna's mother came running, gathering her daughter into her arms and weeping with gratitude. Other villagers emerged from their homes, staring at Clara with something new in their eyes. "You risked your life," Morwenna's mother said, gripping Clara's hands, "for my daughter. A London lady risking everything for a fisher child." "She's not just a fisher child," Clara said quietly. "She's my student." That evening, as Clara tried to salvage what she could from her damaged cottage, she heard footsteps in the courtyard. She emerged to find not one visitor, but a dozen, villagers carrying tools, timber, glass for the windows, even food. Finn's father, a weathered man Clara had never spoken to, stepped forward. "We heard what you did today," he said gruffly. "Figure we owe you some help in return." "You don't owe me anything." "We do," Mrs. McAllister interrupted, appearing with several other women. "You've been teaching our children, asking nothing in return. You saved Morwenna's life. Port Talon takes care of its own." Clara felt her throat tighten. I'm just... "You're one of us now," Finn said simply. "Whether you intended to be or not." They worked through the evening and into the next day. The men repaired the roof while the women salvaged furniture and cleaned the flooded rooms. Someone produced glass for the windows. Someone else brought a hot meal. By nightfall, Ravenwood Cottage was habitable again, rough but whole. As the last of the villagers departed, Mrs. Brennan pulled Clara aside. "What you did today," she said quietly, "was either very brave or very stupid. Probably both." "I couldn't let her fall." "No, I don't suppose you could." Mrs. Brennan's expression softened slightly. "You're tougher than I gave you credit for, Miss Whitmore. London girl or not." That night, alone in her repaired cottage, Clara sat by the fire and thought about what had changed. She'd come to Cornwall as an exile, unwanted and alone. But somehow, in these harsh months, she'd built something real. The school mattered, the children mattered, and today she'd proven that she would fight for them, even if it meant risking everything. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from London. Clara recognized her father's handwriting and opened it with trembling hands. The contents made her sink into the nearest chair. Her father was dying. Consumption, the doctors said. He had perhaps 3 months to live, and he wanted to see her. Victoria had opposed the idea, but he'd insisted. A carriage would arrive within the week to bring Clara back to London for what would likely be their final goodbye. Clara read the letter 3 times, each word feeling like a small death. She'd been angry with her father for so long, angry that he'd married Victoria, angry that he'd allowed her exile, angry that he'd chosen peace over protecting his daughter. But underneath all that anger was love, complicated and painful, but real. She would have to go back to London, back to the ballrooms and the cruelty and the society that had destroyed her, back to Victoria's cold triumph, back to all the people who'd watched her humiliation and done nothing. The thought filled her with dread so thick she could barely breathe. The next day, Clara told Mrs. Brennan about the letter. The housekeeper listened without interruption, then nodded slowly. "You'll need to go, of course. He's your father." "I know, but the children, the school, we'll manage for a few weeks. Might do them good to realize what they'd lose if you didn't come back." "If I come back," Clara corrected. Once she was in London, Victoria would find a way to keep her there. Clara was certain of it. "You'll come back," Mrs. Brennan said with unexpected confidence. "You're not the same girl who arrived here last spring. London couldn't hold you now, even if it tried." Clara wanted to believe that. But the old fear was already creeping back, the fear of being small and powerless and crushed beneath the weight of other people's judgment. She spent the next few days preparing. She told the children there would be no lessons for a few weeks, watching their faces fall with disappointment. She arranged for someone to check on the cottage while she was gone. She packed a trunk with her few good dresses, knowing she'd need to look respectable in London, even if the clothes felt like a costume now. The night before the carriage was due to arrive, Clara couldn't sleep. She walked out to the cliffs despite the darkness, standing where she'd almost died saving Morwenna. The sea crashed below, eternal and indifferent. The stars wheeled overhead, impossibly distant. Who was she now? The exile? The teacher? The woman who belonged nowhere? "Thought I might find you here." Clara turned to find Finn approaching, carrying a lantern against the darkness. "Couldn't sleep either," she asked. "Heard you were leaving tomorrow. Wanted to say goodbye properly." He stood beside her, looking out at the black water. "Will you come back?" "I don't know," Clara admitted. "I want to. But London has a way of making you forget who you are." "Then remember this," Finn said. "Remember that you're the woman who saved Morwenna, who taught my sister to read, who built something real out of nothing." He turned to face her. "You're not the person London thinks you are. You're who you've proven yourself to be here." Clara felt tears sting her eyes. What if that's not enough? It's more than enough. You just have to believe it. The carriage arrived with the dawn, expensive and emblazoned with her father's crest. The driver was the same Roberts who'd brought her to Cornwall, though he seemed startled by the change in her. Clara no longer looked like the defeated girl he'd delivered to this windswept coast. She stood straighter now, met his eyes when she spoke. As the carriage pulled away from Ravenwood Cottage, Clara looked back at the village, at the cliffs, at the wild sea that had become home. "Mrs." Brennan stood in the courtyard, her hand raised in farewell. Further down the path, she could see villagers gathered, watching her leave. She thought about Finn's words, about the woman she'd become, about the choice that lay ahead, not between London and Cornwall, but between the person others wanted her to be and the person she'd discovered she could be. The journey took 3 days. With each mile, Clara felt the weight of her old life settling back onto her shoulders. The landscape changed from wild to cultivated, from free to confined. By the time they reached London, she could barely remember why she'd felt strong in Cornwall. Here, surrounded by the familiar streets and houses and crushing expectations, she felt herself shrinking back into the girl who'd been exiled. The Whitmore townhouse looked exactly as she remembered: elegant, cold, perfect. Victoria met her at the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Clara, darling," she said, loud enough for the servants to hear, "how wonderful that you could come. Your father will be so pleased." Once inside, the mask dropped. "You look dreadful," Victoria said flatly. "We'll need to do something about your appearance before anyone sees you. I won't have people thinking we've let you run completely wild." Clara didn't respond. She simply followed Victoria up the stairs to her old room, a space that felt like a museum now, full of a girl who no longer existed. "Your father is very weak," Victoria continued. "The doctors say it could be any day now. You'll have short visits, nothing that might tire him. And Clara?" Victoria's voice turned sharp. "Don't fill his head with nonsense about Cornwall. Let him die in peace, believing you're happy here where you belong." Where she belonged. The words made Clara want to laugh or scream or both. She was allowed to see her father that evening. He lay in his bed, a shadow of the man she remembered. Consumption had stolen his weight, his color, his strength, but his eyes were clear when he saw her, and they filled with tears. "Clara," he whispered, "my girl." She took his hand, feeling how fragile it had become. "I'm here, Father. I'm sorry." His voice was barely audible. "For everything. For Victoria. For sending you away. For being too weak to protect you." "Don't," Clara said, her own tears falling. "Save your strength. There's something I need to tell you." He struggled to sit up slightly. "Victoria doesn't know. No one knows. But you need to hear it now before it's too late." "What is it?" "The Cornwall estate, Ravenwood Cottage and all the land around it. I put it in your name. Years ago, after your mother died. It belongs to you, Clara, not to Victoria, not to the family trust. You." Clara stared at him in shock. "What?" "It's yours," her father repeated, his grip tightening weakly on her hand. "I knew Victoria would try to control you through money, but the Cornwall property is yours absolutely. When I die, you'll discover you're not as powerless as everyone thinks. The cottage, the land, everything within 3 miles of the coast, it all belongs to you." The revelation stunned her into silence. She owned Ravenwood Cottage. She owned the land the village sat on. She owned the fishing rights, her father continued, reading her thoughts. The harbor fees, the coastal revenue. It's not a fortune, Clara, but it's enough. Enough to live on. Enough to be free. Why didn't you tell me before? Because I was a coward. His eyes closed, exhausted by the effort of speaking. I let Victoria send you away rather than fight her, but I made sure you'd have something she couldn't take. Can you forgive me? Clara looked at her father, this weak man who'd failed her in so many ways, but had also given her the one thing that mattered most. Freedom. Yes, she whispered. I forgive you. He died 3 days later, peacefully in his sleep. The funeral was a grand affair, full of people who'd never cared about Henry Whitmore, but who wanted to be seen paying respects. Clara stood beside Victoria, wearing black and accepting condolences from people who'd mocked her less than a year ago. Duke Julian Ravenscroft attended. When he approached to offer his sympathies, Clara saw genuine sorrow in his eyes. Your father was a good man, Julian said quietly. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you, Your Grace. He hesitated, then spoke more quietly. I heard about what you did, saving that child from the cliffs. That took real courage. Clara met his eyes steadily. Courage is easier when you have something worth fighting for. Something flickered in his expression. Understanding, perhaps, or regret. But before he could respond, Victoria swept in and pulled Clara away to meet some distant relative who wanted to discuss the will. The will reading took place the following week. Victoria sat confidently, certain that everything would pass to her. Clara sat quietly, thinking of her father's secret gift. When the solicitor read the Cornwall bequest, Victoria's face went white with fury. "That's impossible," she said, her voice shaking. "Henry would never—" "The deed was transferred to Miss Clara Whitmore 7 years ago," the solicitor said calmly. "It's quite legal and irrevocable. The property and all associated rights belong entirely to Miss Whitmore." The room erupted in whispers. Clara sat very still, feeling the weight of stares from every person present. She owned land. She owned property. She owned her freedom. Victoria's hand gripped the armrest of her chair so hard her knuckles went white. Clara could see her stepmother calculating, trying to find an angle, a way to contest this or manipulate it to her advantage. "Well," Victoria said finally, her voice like ice, "how fortunate for you, Clara. Though I can't imagine what you'll do with a worthless property in the middle of nowhere. You'll probably want to sell it, put the money to better use." Clara stood and every eye in the room turned to her. "No," she said clearly, "I won't be selling." "Don't be ridiculous," Victoria snapped. "You can't possibly intend to live there permanently. You'll come back to London where you belong." "I don't belong in London," Clara interrupted. "I belong in Cornwall, with the school I built and the children I teach and the people who actually value what I have to offer." The room went deadly silent. "You're being emotional," Victoria said, forcing calm into her voice. "You've just lost your father. You're not thinking clearly." "I'm thinking more clearly than I ever have in my life," Clara said. She turned to the solicitor. "How soon can the estate be settled? When can I access my inheritance?" "Within the month, Miss Whitmore." "Excellent. Then I'll be returning to Cornwall at the end of the week." She walked out of the room, leaving Victoria's fury and London's shocked whispers behind her. In the hallway, her hands finally started to shake, but this time it was from exhilaration rather than fear. She was going home. To Cornwall, to the cliffs, to the life she'd built from exile and abandonment. And this time, no one could send her away. Because the outcast, the exile, the girl they'd thrown away, she owned the very ground they'd tried to bury her on. Clara's declaration sent shockwaves through London society faster than a match thrown into dry kindling. Within 24 hours, the drawing rooms of Mayfair buzzed with scandalized whispers. The plain girl, the exile, the charity case, she owned property, real property, and she was choosing Cornwall over civilization. Victoria's fury was a cold, calculated thing. She didn't rage or throw objects. Instead, she began a campaign of quiet destruction, visiting every influential friend she had, planting seeds of doubt about Clara's mental state. "The poor dear is clearly unstable," Victoria confided to Lady Ashworth over tea. "Grief has addled her mind. She actually believes she can run an estate, her, who can barely manage her own appearance." But Clara didn't hear these whispers because she'd already left London. She departed 3 days after the will reading, taking only what she'd brought with her and leaving behind every dress, every piece of jewelry, every remnant of her old life. The Whitmore townhouse could burn to the ground for all she cared. The journey back to Cornwall felt entirely different from her first trip. Then, she'd been fleeing in shame. Now she was returning as a landowner, a woman of independent means, someone who belonged to herself. When the carriage crested the final hill and Ravenwood Cottage came into view, Clara felt her chest expand with something she barely recognized: joy. Roberts helped her down, looking uncomfortable. "Will there be anything else, Miss Whitmore?" "No, thank you. You've been very kind." He hesitated, then spoke quietly. "For what it's worth, miss, I'm glad you came back. Takes courage, standing up to the likes of Mrs. Whitmore." It was the first time any of her father's servants had acknowledged what she'd endured. Clara smiled at him. "Thank you, Roberts. That means more than you know." After he left, Clara stood in the courtyard of her cottage, her property, and let the truth of it wash over her. This land belonged to her. The cliffs, the wild grass, the roaring sea, all of it was hers. The sound of running feet made her turn. A group of children were racing up the path, led by Morwenna, their faces alight with excitement. "Miss Whitmore," Morwenna shouted, "you came back! We thought Ma said you might not—" Clara caught the girl in a fierce hug. "Of course I came back. I told you I would." "But you're a lady," another child said wonderingly. "A real lady. Ma heard you inherited a fortune." "Not a fortune," Clara corrected, releasing more wanna. But enough. Enough to stay, enough to expand the school, enough to never have to leave again. The children cheered, their voices bright against the gray sky. That evening, Clara walked down to Port Talon to find the village transformed in her absence. Someone had painted "Welcome Home, Miss Whitmore" on a banner hung across the meeting hall. The villagers emerged from their homes as she approached, not with the suspicion they'd once shown, but with genuine warmth. Mrs. McAllister was the first to reach her. "We heard about your father. I'm so sorry." "Thank you," Clara said quietly. "But I'm grateful too. He gave me something precious in the end." "Your freedom," Mrs. McAllister said, understanding immediately. "The whole village has been talking about nothing else. You own the land now. You own the harbor rights." Clara had barely had time to process what that meant. "I suppose I do. The old lord, your father, he was fair enough. Didn't charge us much for the moorings, let us fish without interference, but we were always aware it could change." Mrs. McAllister's eyes searched Clara's face. "What will you do?" It was a test, Clara realized. The villagers had accepted her as a teacher, had come to value her work with their children, but now she held real power over their livelihoods. One thoughtless decision could destroy everything she'd built. "I'll do exactly what my father did," Clara said firmly. "The harbor fees will remain the same. The fishing rights remain yours. Nothing changes except that I'm here, and I actually care about this place." The tension in Mrs. McAllister's shoulders eased. "You're a good woman, Clara Whitmore. Your father raised you right." News of Clara's decision spread through Port Talon like wildfire. By the next morning, when she walked to the meeting hall to resume lessons, she found it full to bursting. Not just the regular students, but new faces, older children who'd never attended before, even a few adults sitting awkwardly in the back. "We want to learn too," one of the fishermen said gruffly. "If you'll have us." Clara looked at the sea of faces, at the hunger for knowledge she saw there, and felt something click into place. This wasn't just a small school for fisher children anymore. This was the beginning of something larger. "Of course I'll have you," she said. "Everyone who wants to learn is welcome." Over the next weeks, Clara threw herself into expanding the school. She used part of her inheritance to buy more books, slates, paper, and pencils. She established separate sessions for different age groups. She even managed to convince Finn McAllister, who'd picked up considerable education from his mother, who'd once been a governess, to help teach mathematics. The school became the heart of Port Talon's transformation. Children who'd never expected to read anything more complex than a fish count were working through poetry. Adults who'd signed their names with an X learned to write letters to relatives in other towns. The change was visible, tangible, undeniable, but success bred resentment in unexpected places. 6 weeks after Clara's return, a stranger arrived in Port Talon. He was a thin, sharp-faced man in expensive clothes who introduced himself as Mr. Pembroke, representative of the Cornwall Education Authority. Mrs. Brennan brought him to Ravenwood Cottage with a worried expression. "He says he needs to speak with you, miss, about the school." Pembroke sat in Clara's small parlor, looking around with barely concealed disdain. "Miss Whitmore, I've come to discuss the unauthorized educational institution you've established in this village." "It's not unauthorized," Clara said carefully. "It's a private school funded by me, on my own land. Actually, the meeting hall where you conduct lessons belongs to the village commons, and while private schools are legal, they must meet certain standards." Pembroke pulled out a document. "Standards which I'm quite certain your establishment does not meet." Clara felt ice forming in her stomach. "What standards?" "Proper facilities, certified instructors, an approved curriculum, religious education." He smiled without warmth. "I'm afraid your little school fails on every count. The children are learning, their parents are grateful. What does it matter if I don't have a certificate from some London institution? It matters because the law says it matters." Pembroke stood. "I'm giving you official notice. You have 30 days to either bring your school into compliance with regulations or shut it down. Good day, Miss Whitmore." After he left, Clara sat in stunned silence. Mrs. Brennan hovered anxiously. "He can't do that, can he? Shut down the school?" "I don't know," Clara admitted, "but I'm going to find out." She spent the next 3 days researching, writing letters to solicitors in Plymouth and Exeter, trying to understand the tangle of laws governing education. The answers she received were discouraging. Pembroke was right, the regulations were clear. Without proper certification, Clara's school was technically illegal. But something about the timing bothered her. The school had been running for months. Why was the Education Authority suddenly interested now? The answer came from an unexpected source. One evening, Finn arrived at her cottage with a crumpled newspaper from London. "You should see this," he said grimly. The article was in the society pages, a venomous piece about delusional spinsters playing at philanthropy. It didn't name Clara directly, but the description was clear enough, and the quoted source was unmistakable. According to Mrs. Victoria Whitmore, her stepdaughter's mental instability has reached dangerous levels, putting innocent children at risk. Clara's hand shook as she read. Victoria hadn't been idle in London. She'd orchestrated this, used her connections to sick the Education Authority on Cornwall, all to punish Clara for daring to claim her inheritance. "This is a war," Clara said quietly. "Then we fight back," Finn replied. "You're not alone this time." The next morning, Clara called a meeting in the village square. Every parent whose child attended the school came, along with many others who'd benefited from the adult lessons. She stood on the steps of the meeting hall and told them everything, about Victoria's campaign, about Pembroke's ultimatum, about the threat to close the school. "I can't get certified in 30 days, she said bluntly. "I don't have the credentials they're demanding. If we follow their rules, the school closes." Angry murmurs rippled through the crowd. "Then we don't follow their rules," Finn's father said loudly. "This is our village. They can't tell us what to do." "They can," Clara corrected, "and they will, unless we find another way." "What way?" Mrs. McAllister asked. Clara had been thinking about this all night, turning the problem over from every angle. There was one solution, but it was audacious to the point of madness. "We build a real school," she said. "Not just lessons in the meeting hall, but an actual building. We create a proper institution that meets every regulation they can throw at us, and we do it in 30 days. The crowd went silent. Then someone laughed, a harsh, disbelieving sound. "You want to build a school in a month?" The speaker was an older fisherman named Tregarth. "With what materials? What money? What labor?" "With what we have," Clara said. "I can provide some funds from my inheritance, but mostly we'll need labor, materials, and the will to prove that Port Talon doesn't bow to London bureaucrats who've never set foot in Cornwall." She saw skepticism on many faces. The task was enormous, perhaps impossible. But she also saw something else, the spark of defiance that fishermen developed from spending their lives battling the sea. "How much money can you provide?" Tregarth asked. £50, Clara said. It was a third of her annual income from the estate, a staggering sum to gamble on a single project. Tregarth whistled low. "That's real money." "My father gave me this land so I could be free," Clara said. "But freedom isn't just for me. It's for your children too. For every child who deserves to learn regardless of what some London authority thinks they're worth." "I'll help," Finn said immediately. "I can work evenings after fishing." "I'll donate timber from my stock," another man called out. "Have it left over from last season." "My cousin works stone," a woman added. "I'll ask him to help." One by one, villagers stepped forward with offers: labor, materials, skills, time. Within an hour, Clara had commitments for everything needed to build a small school building on the piece of land adjacent to the meeting hall. "We'll need a plan," Tregarth said, his skepticism giving way to cautious enthusiasm. "Proper foundations, walls that'll withstand the winter storms. Can't be shoddy work if we're trying to impress these inspectors." "I know someone who might help," Clara said slowly. "But I'll need to swallow my pride to ask him." That evening, Clara sat at her small desk and wrote a letter she'd sworn she'd never write. Her hand trembled as she formed the words. "Your Grace, I am writing to request your assistance with a matter that affects the education of children in Port Talon. The school I established is under threat of closure unless it meets certain regulatory standards within 30 days. We are attempting to build a proper school building, but we need architectural expertise we do not possess. I would not ask this if the stakes were not so high. These children deserve better than to be used as pawns in Victoria Whitmore's vendetta against me. If you truly meant what you said about the value of this work, now is your chance to prove it. Clara Whitmore. She sealed the letter before she could reconsider and sent it with the next post. 3 days later, Duke Julian Ravenscroft arrived in Port Talon in a carriage that made the villagers stare. Clara met him in the village square, acutely aware of dozens of eyes watching from windows and doorways. "You came," she said, surprised despite herself. "You asked," Julian replied. "May I see the site?" She led him to the plot of land where foundation work had already begun. Villagers had cleared the ground and were starting to lay stones, working from dawn until dark. Julian studied the site with the practiced eye of someone who'd overseen many construction projects. "You're building on a slope," he observed. "The drainage will be problematic unless you account for it in the foundation." "We don't know how to account for it," Clara admitted. "That's why I asked for your help." Julian turned to face her. "Why did you really write to me? You hate me, and you have every right to." Clara met his eyes steadily. "I do hate you. Or I did. I'm not sure what I feel now except desperate. Those children need this school, and I can't build it alone." "You're not alone," Julian said, gesturing at the villagers who were already returning to work despite his intimidating presence. "You have an entire community behind you. That's more than most people ever achieve. It's not enough. Not against Victoria and her lawyers and the education authority. Then we'll make it enough." Julian rolled up his sleeves, an aristocrat preparing to do manual labor, which made several villagers stop and stare. "I'll draw up proper plans tonight. We'll need to modify the foundation, add drainage channels, reinforce the walls for coastal weather. But it's doable in 30 days if we're smart about it." Over the next 4 weeks, Port Talon transformed into a construction site. Julian brought in 2 of his own architects to oversee the work, but the labor came from the villagers themselves. Fishermen worked before dawn and after dusk. Women mixed mortar and carried stones. Even the children helped where they could, fetching tools and water. Clara worked alongside them, her hands blistering and her muscles aching. She'd never done physical labor before, but she learned quickly, driven by the same fierce determination that had helped her survive exile. Julian worked too, surprising everyone. He hauled timber, helped dig drainage trenches, and consulted with local craftsmen about the best way to weatherproof the building. At night, he stayed at the village inn, a far cry from his usual accommodations, and drew up plans by candlelight. Slowly, impossibly, a building rose from the muddy ground. 4 walls of strong Cornish stone, a slate roof built to withstand winter gales, glass windows that let in light, a solid floor that wouldn't turn to mud in rain. Inside, wooden benches built by the village carpenter, a real chalkboard mounted on the wall, shelves for books. It was beautiful in its simplicity, nothing like the grand halls of London, but perfect for its purpose. On the 28th day, with 2 days remaining before Pembroke's deadline, they finished. The villagers stood back to look at what they'd built, and Clara saw tears on more than one weathered face. "It's a real school," Morwenna whispered, awestruck. "Yes," Clara agreed, her own voice thick with emotion. "It's real." Julian stood beside her, covered in stone dust and looking more human than she'd ever seen him. "You did it." "We did it," Clara corrected. "I couldn't have managed this without your help." "I owed you more than help," Julian said quietly. "I owed you an apology that actually meant something. I hope this is a start." Before Clara could respond, a commotion erupted near the village square. A carriage had arrived, expensive, emblazoned with official seals. Mr. Pembroke emerged, accompanied by 2 other men in formal dress. "They're early," Finn muttered. "Inspection wasn't supposed to happen until tomorrow." "They're trying to catch us unprepared," Clara realized. "Make sure we fail." Pembroke approached with a smug expression that faltered when he saw the completed school building. "Miss Whitmore, I've come to conduct the official inspection." "Of course," Clara said calmly. "Please, come inside." Pembroke and his companions entered the school with expressions of deep skepticism. They examined every corner, tested the stability of benches, checked the quality of materials. They studied the curriculum Clara had prepared, the attendance records she'd meticulously kept, the examples of student work she'd carefully preserved. They found nothing wrong. The building met every regulation. The materials exceeded standards. The curriculum was comprehensive and well documented. Pembroke's face grew increasingly red as the inspection continued. Finally, he turned to Clara with barely concealed fury. "The building is adequate," he said through gritted teeth, "but you still lack proper certification as an instructor. Without that, this school cannot—" "Actually," Julian interrupted, stepping forward, "Miss Whitmore has certification." Clara stared at him in confusion. She most certainly did not have certification. Julian produced a document from his jacket. The Ravenscroft Foundation provides educational grants and certifications for exceptional teachers working in underserved communities. As founder and director of the foundation, I have the authority to grant certification based on demonstrated competence rather than formal credentials. Miss Whitmore's work over the past months more than qualifies her. "That's highly irregular," Pembroke sputtered. "But entirely legal," Julian said smoothly. "The foundation was chartered by Parliament 20 years ago. Its certifications are recognized throughout England. Unless you'd like to challenge a parliamentary charter?" Pembroke's mouth worked silently. He looked at the school, at the document, at the crowd of villagers watching with hard eyes. Finally, he turned to his companions. "We're done here," he snapped. "The school meets minimum standards. Barely." He stormed back to his carriage without another word, his companions scurrying after him. As the carriage disappeared down the coastal road, the villagers erupted in cheers. Children jumped and shouted. Adults embraced. Someone started singing an old Cornish folk song, and others joined in. Clara turned to Julian. "You have a foundation?" "As of 3 weeks ago, yes," he admitted. "I created it specifically for this situation. The parliamentary charter is real. My family has enough influence to arrange such things quickly when necessary. I thought it might be useful." "You lied to Pembroke." "I bent the truth creatively. The foundation exists, and I did just grant you certification. Everything I said was technically accurate." He smiled slightly. "Sometimes fighting bureaucracy requires its own bureaucracy." Clara didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "Why would you do all this for me?" Julian's smile faded. "Because what I did to you in that ballroom was unforgivable. Because watching you build something meaningful from nothing made me realize how empty my own life has been. Because you deserved someone in your corner, fighting for you the way you fight for these children." Around them, the celebration continued. But Clara stood very still, looking at this man who'd been her tormentor and had somehow become her ally. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything." "I should be thanking you," Julian replied. "You've reminded me what courage actually looks like, and what it means to stand for something larger than yourself." That evening, Port Talon held a celebration in the new school. Families brought food, fishermen brought ale, and someone produced a fiddle for music. The villagers danced and sang, celebrating not just a building, but a victory over forces that had tried to crush them. Clara stood in the doorway of her school, watching the celebration, and felt a profound sense of rightness. This was where she belonged. These were her people. This was her purpose. Finn approached, offering her a cup of cider. "You did it, Miss Whitmore. You beat them." "We did it," Clara corrected, as she had with Julian. "All of us together?" "Fair enough." Finn clinked his cup against hers. "To victories won by people who refuse to give up." "To refusing to give up," Clara echoed. Later, as the celebration wound down and families began walking home in the twilight, Julian found Clara one last time. "I'll be leaving in the morning," he said, "back to London and my usual responsibilities. But I meant what I said about the Ravenscroft Foundation. I'm going to make it real. Establish more schools, train more teachers, help more communities like Port Talon. If you're willing, I'd like your advice on how to do it right." Clara studied him, this man who'd changed so much from the arrogant duke who danced with her out of pity. "Why the transformation?" "Because I saw what you became when you stopped caring about London's approval," Julian said simply. "And I wanted to become someone better too. Someone who actually deserves the privilege they were born into." "That's going to be hard work." "The best things usually are." He held out his hand. "Can we start again? Not as Duke and Exile, but as two people trying to do something worthwhile." Clara looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment. Then she took it. "Partners in education," she said. "Nothing more." "For now," Julian agreed. "That's more than I have any right to ask for." He left the next morning, but something had shifted between them, a foundation of mutual respect built on shared purpose rather than social convention. Over the following weeks, news of Port Talon's school spread throughout Cornwall and beyond. Other villages sent representatives to see it, asking how they might establish similar institutions. Clara found herself writing letters, sharing her curriculum, advising other teachers. The school that had started as a desperate attempt to fill empty hours had become a movement. And Clara Whitmore, the plain girl who'd been exiled, the woman who'd been told she had no value, had become someone who changed lives simply by refusing to accept the limitations others tried to impose. She'd built a school. She'd won a battle. She'd proven her worth not through beauty or social standing, but through determination, intelligence, and the courage to stand firm when everything seemed impossible. It wasn't the end of her story, but it was the moment when Clara finally understood that she'd never been powerless. She'd only been told she was powerless so often that she'd almost believed it. Now she knew better, and there was no going back to the girl she'd been before. Winter came early to Cornwall that year, bringing storms that turned the sea into a churning beast and wind that howled through Port Talon like something alive. But inside the new school, warmth and light pushed back against the darkness. 30 students now filled the benches, ranging from 6-year-old Bethan's youngest brother to Mrs. Penrose, the vegetable seller who'd decided at 53 that it was never too late to learn to read. Clara stood at the front of the classroom on a particularly brutal December morning, teaching a lesson on geography, when Mrs. Brennan appeared in the doorway with an expression that meant trouble. "Letter from London," the housekeeper said quietly, "marked urgent." Clara excused herself and stepped outside into the biting wind. The envelope bore Victoria's seal, which immediately set her teeth on edge. She'd heard nothing from her stepmother since leaving London 5 months ago, a silence she'd interpreted as blessed defeat. She should have known better. The letter was brief and venomous. "Clara, your little performance in Cornwall has attracted more attention than you realize. Questions are being asked about the legitimacy of your inheritance, the propriety of an unmarried woman living alone in such isolation, and your fitness to manage property of significant value. I have filed a formal challenge to your inheritance on the grounds of your father's diminished mental capacity when he transferred the deed. Several doctors are prepared to testify that consumption had affected his judgment months before his death. A hearing is scheduled for January 15th in London. Your presence is required by law. If you fail to appear, the court will rule in my favor by default, and the Cornwall properties will revert to the family trust, which I control absolutely. I suggest you enjoy your rustic fantasy while it lasts. Victoria." Clara read the letter 3 times, each pass making her hands shake harder. Victoria was challenging the inheritance itself. If she won, Clara would lose everything: the cottage, the land, the school, her independence. She'd be right back where she started, powerless and at Victoria's mercy. "Bad news?" Mrs. Brennan asked. "The worst," Clara said quietly. She explained the situation, watching the housekeeper's face grow increasingly grim. Can she really do that? Challenge a legal deed? Apparently she can try. Clara looked at the school building where her students waited, and if I don't show up to defend it, she wins automatically. Then you'll go to London and fight her. I don't know how. I don't have lawyers or doctors or influential friends to testify for me. Victoria has all of that and more. Clara felt the old powerlessness creeping back, that terrible feeling of being small and voiceless against forces too large to resist. Mrs. Brennan gripped her shoulders, forcing Clara to meet her eyes. Listen to me. You're not the same girl who arrived here terrified and alone. You built a school from nothing. You saved a child's life. You stood up to bureaucrats and won. Don't you dare let that woman make you forget who you've become. The words steadied something inside Clara. Mrs. Brennan was right. She'd changed. The question was whether that change was enough to face Victoria on her own territory. That evening, Clara called an emergency meeting at the school. She told the assembled villagers everything about Victoria's challenge, the upcoming hearing, the threat to the school's existence. If she wins, I lose the property, Clara said bluntly. and whoever takes control might not be as generous about harbor fees or fishing rights. They almost certainly won't continue funding the school. Silence fell, heavy and oppressive. Finally, Tregarth spoke. We could testify. Tell the court what you've done here, how you've managed the property, how you've helped the community. Would they listen to fishermen? Someone else asked bitterly. We're nobody to London folk. We're not nobody, Finn said, standing. We're the people who actually know Clara Whitmore. Not the rumors or the gossip, but the real person. That has to count for something. He's right, Mrs. McAllister added. I'll come to London with you, Clara. I'll tell them what you've accomplished. I'll come too, Tregarth said. And me, added Mrs. Penrose. One by one, hands rose throughout the room. Within minutes, 20 villagers had volunteered to make the journey to London to speak on Clara's behalf. Clara felt tears burning her eyes. You don't have to do this. The journey alone will cost more than most of you can spare. You gave our children a future, Mrs. McAllister interrupted. We'll give you whatever support you need. The next morning, Clara wrote to Julian, explaining the situation and asking if he knew any lawyers who might take her case. His response arrived within 3 days. Clara, Victoria's challenge is despicable, but not unexpected. I've engaged the finest solicitor in London, Edward Hartley, to represent you. He'll meet with you 1 week before the hearing to prepare your defense. As for testimony about your competence and character, I have a suggestion. Rather than bringing villagers to London where they'll be dismissed as ignorant country folk, why not bring London to them? I'm organizing a delegation of educators, reformers, and members of Parliament to visit Port Talon and see your work firsthand. If they witness what you've built, they can testify from positions of authority that the court will actually respect. The hearing is in 5 weeks. That gives us time to build an unassailable case. Trust me. Julian. Clara stared at the letter, torn between hope and skepticism. Bringing influential Londoners to Cornwall was audacious, but it might actually work. Over the next 3 weeks, Clara prepared for the most important performance of her life. She organized the school's records meticulously, compiled portfolios of student work, prepared detailed financial accounts of how she'd managed the estate. She rehearsed her testimony with Mrs. Brennan playing the hostile questioner, forcing Clara to defend every decision she'd made. And she painted. Clara had always sketched in her spare moments, but now she threw herself into creating something more ambitious. She set up an easel in the school during off hours and painted portraits, not of London society ladies in their finest gowns, but of Port Talon's people in their truest forms. Mrs. Penrose with her work-worn hands sorting vegetables, dignity radiating from every brushstroke. Finn's father mending nets, the morning light catching the concentration on his weathered face. Morwenna reading aloud to younger children, her expression fierce with determination. Each portrait captured something London society had taught Clara to dismiss: the quiet nobility of ordinary lives, the beauty in faces that had known struggle and survived it. When Julian's delegation arrived 2 weeks before the hearing, Clara was ready. The group consisted of 12 people, 3 members of Parliament, 2 educational reformers, 4 prominent writers and journalists, 2 ladies from aristocratic families known for their charitable work, and Julian himself. They arrived in a carriage convoy that made every villager stop and stare. Clara met them in the village square, acutely aware that this was her one chance to prove herself to people who could actually influence the court's decision. "Welcome to Port Talon," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Thank you for making this journey." One of the MPs, a stern-faced man named Lord Ashford, looked around skeptically. "We've come a very long way on a very cold day, Miss Whitmore. I hope this will be worth our time." "I hope so too," Clara replied. "Let me show you why I believe education can transform lives." She led them to the school, where her students were assembled. The delegation filed in, their expensive clothes and refined manner making the children shrink back nervously. Clara began simply, asking Morwenna to read a passage from a book. The girl's voice was clear and confident as she read a complex paragraph about Greek mythology. "Very nice," one of the reformers said condescendingly, "but surely any child can be taught to read a prepared passage." "Morwenna," Clara interrupted, "please tell our guests what this passage means, in your own words." The girl thought for a moment, then launched into an explanation that demonstrated genuine comprehension. connecting the myth to themes of hubris and consequences. The reformers' condescension faded. Clara had other students demonstrate mathematics, geography, basic science. She showed the delegation writing samples, explained her curriculum, detailed how she'd adapted teaching methods to meet students' individual needs. Then she showed them the portraits. The delegation moved silently through the small gallery Clara had arranged, studying each painting. These weren't rough sketches, but serious artistic works that captured both the physical reality and inner life of each subject. "These are remarkable," one of the journalists said quietly. She was studying the portrait of Mrs. Penrose. "You painted these?" "Yes. These are the people Victoria Whitmore claims I'm too incompetent to live among. The people she believes aren't worth educating." Clara's voice hardened. "I wanted you to see them as I do, as individuals with dignity, intelligence, and worth that has nothing to do with titles or wealth." Lady Catherine Bromley, one of the aristocratic women, stepped closer to Clara. "You're making a political statement." "I'm making a human statement," Clara corrected, "that every person deserves the chance to develop their potential, regardless of birth or circumstance." The delegation spent 3 hours at the school, questioning students, examining records, observing lessons. Then Clara took them on a tour of Port Talon, showing them the harbor where her fair management of fees had allowed the fishing fleet to expand, the homes where literacy had opened new opportunities, the community that had flourished under her stewardship. By evening, when they gathered at the village inn for dinner, the skepticism had vanished from most faces. Lord Ashford, the stern MP, raised his glass. "Miss Whitmore, I came here expecting to find a foolish girl playing at charity. Instead, I find a competent administrator, gifted teacher, and genuinely talented artist. You have my support in this hearing." Others echoed his sentiment. The journalists were already making notes for articles about the remarkable school in Cornwall. The educational reformers wanted to model future institutions on Clara's methods. Julian caught Clara's eye across the room and smiled. They'd done it. They'd turned skeptics into advocates. But that night, alone at Ravenwood Cottage, Clara couldn't shake a sense of unease. Victoria had proven herself a formidable enemy. She wouldn't go down without a vicious fight. The hearing was scheduled for January 15th at the Court of Chancery in London. Clara arrived 3 days early, staying at a modest hotel and meeting daily with Edward Hartley, her solicitor, to prepare. Hartley was a sharp-eyed man in his 50s who'd made his reputation defending unpopular causes. "Mrs. Whitmore will argue that your father was mentally incompetent when he transferred the deed. She has 3 doctors prepared to testify that consumption can cause cognitive decline." "My father was perfectly lucid when we spoke before he died," Clara insisted. "Your testimony against multiple medical experts may not be enough. We need to demonstrate that you're a competent property manager, which we can do easily thanks to the delegation's support, but we also need to undermine the medical testimony." Hartley studied her carefully. "Did your father leave any other legal documents near the end of his life? Anything that would demonstrate clear thinking?" Clara thought hard. There were letters. He wrote to his solicitor about various matters even in his final weeks. "Get them. If we can show he was conducting complex business right up until his death, it weakens the incompetence claim." The morning of January 15th dawned cold and gray. Clara dressed in her finest gown, not one of the fashionable London dresses from her old life, but a simple dark blue dress she'd had made in Cornwall. She looked like exactly what she was, a working woman who'd earned her place through effort rather than privilege. The courtroom was packed. Victoria sat at the front with her lawyers, looking immaculate and confident. Behind her were the doctors she'd recruited, all distinguished men with impressive credentials. On Clara's side sat Edward Hartley, the members of Julian's delegation who'd agreed to testify, and, to Clara's shock, a dozen villagers from Port Talon who'd made the journey at their own expense. "We weren't going to let you face this alone," Mrs. McAllister whispered when Clara turned to stare at them. The judge entered. Lord Justice Pemberton, an elderly man with a reputation for fairness but also for adherence to strict legal precedent. Victoria's lawyer opened with a devastating attack. He painted Clara as an unstable spinster who'd taken advantage of a dying man's confusion. The 3 doctors testified that consumption frequently caused mental deterioration, confusion, and impaired judgment. They couldn't speak to Henry Whitmore's specific condition, but they painted a convincing picture of a man whose final decisions couldn't be trusted. When it was Hartley's turn, he began with the letters Clara had obtained from her father's solicitor. Each one was read aloud, detailed instructions about investments, clear directives about property management, complex legal considerations, all dated within weeks of Henry Whitmore's death. "This is the correspondence of a confused man?" Hartley asked pointedly. "These letters demonstrate sophisticated financial understanding and careful long-term planning." Victoria's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. The medical testimony had been undermined. Then Hartley called his witnesses. Lord Ashford testified about Clara's competent management of a productive estate. The educational reformers spoke about her innovative teaching methods. The journalists described the thriving community she'd helped build. Lady Catherine Bromley delivered perhaps the most powerful testimony. "I have visited countless charitable institutions run by wealthy women who treat the poor as objects of pity. Miss Whitmore is different. She sees the people of Port Talon as equals worthy of respect. That's not incompetence. That's rare wisdom and humanity." When Julian took the stand, he spoke with careful precision. "I have known Miss Whitmore in two contexts. First, in London society, where I observed her being systematically diminished and dismissed. Second, in Cornwall, where I witnessed her building something of genuine value. The difference is striking and entirely due to her own efforts. She didn't inherit competence. She developed it through determination and courage." His eyes found Clara's. "I was wrong about her once. I won't make that mistake again." Finally, Hartley called Clara herself. She walked to the witness stand on legs that threatened to give out, acutely aware of every eye in the courtroom watching her. Victoria's lawyer stood, ready to destroy her. "Miss Whitmore, is it true that you were exiled to Cornwall by your family?" "I was sent to Cornwall, yes." "Because you were an embarrassment? Unsuitable for London society?" Clara took a breath. "I was sent away because my stepmother found my presence inconvenient." "Because you were plain, unmarried, and socially awkward?" "Because I was honest, independent, and refused to pretend otherwise." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Victoria's face tightened. The lawyer tried another approach. "You have no formal education in estate management, no training as a teacher, no qualifications whatsoever. Isn't that correct?" "I have something better than formal credentials," Clara said clearly. "I have results. The estate is profitable. The school is thriving. The community is stronger. You can question my qualifications all you want, but you can't argue with outcomes." "Outcomes that required substantial help from the Duke of Ravenscroft." "The Duke provided architectural expertise for one building project," Clara interrupted. "Everything else, the teaching, the management, the daily work of actually caring about people. That was me." She turned to face the judge directly, forgetting the lawyer entirely. "My father gave me that property because he knew I would use it well, because he understood that worth isn't determined by beauty or social standing or formal education. It's determined by what you do with what you're given." Her voice grew stronger. "I was given exile and isolation. I built a school and a community. If that's incompetence, then I'm proud to be incompetent." The courtroom erupted. The judge called for order, banging his gavel repeatedly. When silence finally fell, Victoria's lawyer had no more questions. The judge deliberated for 2 hours while everyone waited in tense silence. Clara sat with the villagers, their quiet presence a comfort against the oppressive anxiety. Finally, the judge returned. "I have considered the evidence carefully," Lord Justice Pemberton said. "The medical testimony about consumption's effects is noted, but not conclusive regarding Mr. Whitmore's specific condition. The documentary evidence of his continued mental acuity is compelling." Clara held her breath. "Furthermore, Miss Whitmore's management of the Cornwall property has been exemplary by every measure. The court finds no grounds to question her competence." He looked directly at Victoria. "The challenge to the inheritance is denied. The property remains in Miss Clara Whitmore's sole possession and control." The courtroom exploded again, but this time with cheers. The villagers embraced each other. Lord Ashford clapped Julian on the shoulder. The journalists were already rushing out to file their stories. Victoria sat frozen, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. As Clara walked past her toward the exit, Victoria grabbed her arm. "This isn't over," she hissed. "I'll find another way." "No, you won't," Clara said quietly. Because I'm done being afraid of you. You can't hurt me anymore, Victoria. I'm not the powerless girl you sent away, and I never will be again. She pulled free and walked out into the cold London air, surrounded by people who'd fought for her, believing she was worth fighting for. That evening, Julian hosted a celebration dinner at his London house for everyone who'd testified. The meal was elegant but warm, full of laughter and stories, and the kind of genuine connection Clara had once thought impossible among the wealthy. As dessert was being served, Julian stood and raised his glass. "To Clara Whitmore," he said, "who taught us all that courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about doing what matters despite the fear." "To Clara," everyone echoed. Later, as guests began to depart, Julian found Clara on the terrace overlooking the gardens. "What will you do now?" he asked. "Go home," Clara said simply. "Back to Cornwall, back to the school, back to the life I've built." "And if I asked you to stay in London, to help establish schools here, to join the Foundation's work, to—" He hesitated. "To give me a chance to prove I've changed?" Clara looked at him carefully. Over the past months, she'd watched Julian transform from the arrogant duke who'd humiliated her into someone genuinely committed to meaningful work. She'd seen him haul timber, argue with bureaucrats, fight for children he'd never met. The change seemed real, but real didn't mean ready. "I won't stay in London," she said gently. "This city nearly destroyed me once. I won't give it another chance." "Then I'll come to Cornwall," Julian said immediately. "Not to interfere with your work, but to learn from it. To help, if you'll let me. He took a breath. "To court you properly, if you're willing." Clara felt her heart twist. Part of her wanted to say yes immediately, but another part, the part that had survived exile and built something real, knew she needed to be certain. "Come to Cornwall," she said finally. "Work with the Foundation, help establish more schools, prove that your commitment to this isn't just about impressing me. If after 6 months you still want to court me, we'll talk about it then." 6 months, Julian repeated. "I can do that." "Without expectations," Clara added firmly. "I need to know you're doing this work because it matters to you, not because you think it'll win me over." "It does matter to me. You showed me that." Julian smiled. "But I'd be lying if I said winning you over wasn't part of my motivation." "Honesty," Clara said. "That's a good start." She left London the next day, eager to be home. The journey felt different this time. Not a flight from shame, but a return to purpose. When the carriage finally reached Ravenwood Cottage, and she saw the familiar cliffs and wild sea, Clara felt something settle deep in her chest. This was where she belonged. The school term resumed the following week. Clara stood before her students, now numbering 40, with 3 more villages sending children, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. "I have something to tell you," she said. "Some of you heard about the court case in London, about my stepmother trying to take away the school." The children nodded solemnly. "She lost," Claire continued, "which means the school is safe. This building, this education, all of it, it's permanent now. No one can take it away." The children cheered, but Clara held up her hand for silence. "I want you to understand something important. It wasn't my money or my title that won that case. It was the evidence of what we've built together. Your hard work, your progress, your transformation. That's what convinced the court I was competent." She looked around the room at faces that had once been wary and were now eager, engaged, hungry for knowledge. "You saved the school by being excellent students, by proving that education matters regardless of birth or wealth or what society thinks you deserve. I hope you're proud of that." "We're proud of you, miss," Morwenna said quietly, "for fighting for us." "And I'm proud of all of you," Claire replied, "for fighting for yourselves." The months that followed brought changes. Julian established his foundation properly, with Clara as chief advisor. Together they opened 4 more schools across Cornwall using the Port Talon model. Julian visited monthly, working alongside Clara, learning to see the world through her eyes, not from above, but from the ground where real people lived real lives. Clara watched him change day by day, shedding privilege like dead skin. He became someone who understood that power meant nothing without purpose, that wealth was worthless if you didn't use it to create opportunities for others. And slowly, carefully, Claire began to trust that the change was permanent. 6 months to the day after the London dinner, Julian returned to Port Talon. He found Clara at the cliff's edge where they'd first had their honest conversation, watching the sunset paint the sea in shades of gold and crimson. "It's been 6 months," he said without preamble. "I know. I've spent them trying to become someone worthy of you, building schools, training teachers, using my privilege for something that actually matters." He stepped closer. "Has it been enough?" Clara turned to face him. "You're asking the wrong question." "What's the right question?" "Not whether you're worthy of me, but whether we're equals. Whether you see me as a partner, not a prize. Whether you understand that I'll never be the kind of wife who stays silent and decorative." "I don't want you silent and decorative," Julian said fiercely. "I want you exactly as you are, brilliant, stubborn, fearless, and completely unwilling to compromise on the things that matter." "Marriage would mean sharing everything," Clara warned. "The schools, the foundation, the decisions about how to use your wealth and influence. I won't be a figurehead." "I'm counting on it." Julian took her hands. "Clara Whitmore, will you marry me? Not as a duke taking a wife, but as a partner who wants to build something meaningful with an equal?" Clara looked at this man who'd once represented everything she hated about London society and now embodied the possibility of change. She thought about the journey that had brought them both here, from that humiliating ballroom to this windswept cliff where they stood as equals. "Yes," she said, "on one condition. Anything. We don't live in London. We make Cornwall our home. The schools stay our priority. And we never ever forget what it's like to be powerless, because that's what keeps us honest." "Done," Julian said immediately. He pulled her close, and they kissed with the sea crashing below and the wind whipping around them, two people who'd found each other by first finding themselves. The wedding took place 3 months later at the Port Talon School. Not in a grand London church, but in the simple stone building Clara and the villagers had built with their own hands. Every student attended, along with the entire village, and a carefully selected group from London who'd proven they understood what Clara and Julian were trying to accomplish. Victoria was not invited. Clara heard later that her stepmother had left London society entirely, unable to bear the gossip about losing to the girl she'd tried to destroy. Clara felt no triumph at Victoria's downfall, just relief that she'd never have to think about her again. The years that followed brought growth beyond anything Clara had imagined. The Ravenscroft Foundation established 32 schools across England, each one modeled on the principles Clara had developed in Port Talon. Thousands of children learned to read, write, and imagine futures their parents had never dreamed possible. Clara's paintings gained recognition too. A London gallery exhibited her portraits of working people, and the show caused a sensation. Critics praised her ability to capture dignity in ordinary lives, to find beauty in faces society had taught them to overlook. She never stopped teaching. Even as the foundation grew, even as demands on her time multiplied, Clara spent 3 mornings a week at the Port Talon School, working directly with students. It kept her grounded, reminded her why all the other work mattered. Julian proved himself in ways large and small. He fought for education reform in Parliament, using his title and influence to push for laws that made schooling more accessible. He learned to sail with the Port Talon fishermen, to mend nets, to understand the rhythms of life that had once been completely foreign to him. And he loved Clara with a devotion that never wavered, never demanded she be anything other than exactly who she was. On a spring morning 5 years after their wedding, Clara stood once again on the cliffs above Ravenwood Cottage. The landscape had changed, more buildings now as the village expanded. The school had doubled in size, the harbor bustled with boats painted in bright colors. But the essential wildness remained. The sea still crashed against the rocks. The wind still howled, the sky still stretched vast and infinite overhead. Clara was 40 now, her hair showing threads of silver, her hands marked by years of work. She was no longer young, no longer plain or beautiful, or any of the words society used to reduce women to their appearance. She was simply Clara. Teacher, artist, reformer, wife. A woman who'd been thrown away and had built herself into someone impossible to ignore. "There you are." Julian appeared beside her, their daughter balanced on his hip. Little Margaret was 3, with Clara's sharp eyes and Julian's dark hair already showing signs of her mother's stubborn independence. "Mama!" Margaret reached for Clara, who took her and spun her around, laughing at the child's delighted shrieks. "I was just thinking," Clara said, settling Margaret on her hip, "about the girl I used to be. The one who stood in a ballroom being mocked and believed she had no worth." "That girl was wrong," Julian said softly. "No," Clara corrected. "That girl was told a lie so many times she almost believed it, but she survived long enough to discover the truth." She looked at her daughter, at her husband, at the village, and school, and life she'd built from nothing. "The truth that worth isn't given by others," Clara continued. "It's claimed by yourself, and once you claim it, no one can ever take it away." Margaret squirmed to be put down, and Clara released her to toddle toward the wildflowers growing near the cliff's edge, with Julian following close to keep her safe. Clara stood alone for one more moment, breathing in the salt air, feeling the wind on her face, listening to the eternal song of the sea. She thought about the ballroom where she'd been humiliated, about the exile that had saved her, about the children who'd learned to read by candlelight, about the school built by community effort, about the battle won through courage and the life built through determination. The world had tried to tell her she was nothing, plain, powerless, worthless. But Clara Whitmore had proven them wrong. Not through beauty or wealth or social standing, but through the simple, radical act of refusing to accept other people's judgment as truth. She'd built a life so powerful, so meaningful, so undeniably valuable that the world had no choice but to see her. And once seen, she could never be forgotten. The girl they'd laughed at had become the woman who changed everything, not through revenge, but through the quiet revolution of believing she deserved better and then building better with her own hands. That was the story Clara would pass down to her daughter, to her students, to every person who ever felt small or powerless or invisible. That you can survive exile. You can transform humiliation into purpose. You can build meaning from rejection. All you need is courage enough to stand at the edge of the cliff, look out at the vast and terrifying unknown, and decide that your life belongs to you. And then begin.